Hello and welcome back. Today we are talking about one of my favorite topics, survey designs. I used the large national survey when I was working on my dissertation. So let's jump into it. This is adapted from chapter 12 of your textbook. Survey research designs are procedures in quantitative research in which investigators administer a survey to a sample or to the entire population of people in order to describe the attitudes, opinions, behaviors, or characteristics of a population. We use survey research to assess trends, to assess opinions, beliefs, and attitudes of individuals, for follow up analyses, and for program evaluation. Now, survey research started in the 1800s, and Stanley Hall, this is a picture of Stanley Hall, was a famous American psychologist. In fact, he was partly responsible for the expansion of psychology as a discipline here in the U.S. And he did a survey of children in 1890. Now, one of the things you'll find out about some of these early researchers is there's kind of like a dark side. Stanley Hall was involved in the eugenics movement, which basically preached that some people are better than others, and those people that are not as good, and uh, it was a very racist system, and so people of color, many women of color, um, as a result of the eugenics movement, were forcibly sterilized. And so, yeah, kind of there's a dark side, but even so, Stanley Hall is um, credited with being very influential in the field of psychology. During World War I and World War II, sampling techniques improved, and currently there are wide applications for surveys in the social sciences, in marketing research, in public opinion research, and in journalism. Universities have established social science research centers, and usually those centers are who put out surveys. Also, private organizations such as Gallup, RAND, and Roper conduct influential surveys, and internet based surveys are widely used nowadays. I'm sure you've taken some of those in the past. The steps in conducting survey research include deciding if a survey is the best approach to use, identifying the research questions or hypotheses, identifying the population, the sampling frame, and the sample, determining the survey design and the data collection procedures, developing or locating an instrument to use. The instrument is like the actual survey, like the questions on the piece of paper. Administering the instrument, analyzing the data to address the research question or hypotheses, writing the report, and we're adding final step, taking an action based on what we found out. There are several different types of surveys. So, cross sectional surveys, we're taking a survey of a group of people at one point in time. Longitudinal surveys is we're gathering information from people over a long period of time, or when it might not be that long, but we're gathering information more than once. So, um, I want to start with cross sectional surveys. These are studies at one point in time. They're used for program evaluation, for evaluating community needs, like needs assessments, for assessing attitudes and practices. They're used for group comparisons, and there are also national surveys that are cross sectional surveys that are administered by governments or by other groups to get a picture of national attitudes, practices, and so on. Longitudinal surveys study something over time. They might the mo When you think of a longitudinal survey, the most common type that you think of are what are called panel designs. That's where you get a group of people in your sample, you survey them at one point in time, you survey those same group of people at a later point, and so on and so on. That's called a panel design. A cohort design looks at a subpopulation that's identified by a certain characteristic. And you continue to look at that same subpopulation, but maybe not at the same exact people. So, for example, if I were to study 18-year-olds, kids who are, if I wanted to see what the um, further education and job prospects of kids who graduated from high school in 2019, I might start by surveying 18-year-olds now, and then in 4 years, I might survey 23-year-olds. But it might not be the same group of kids. But just to get a sense of what happened with the cohort that was 18 in 2019, that's how I would do it. And then trend type surveys look at trends in the same population over time. And then a lot of times this has to do with attitudes or perspectives. Okay. And this is basically what I just said. What I just said. Okay, let's talk about sampling from a population. We typically select a sample from a population because we cannot um, ask everyone in the population. So, for example, my dissertation was on teachers, right? And of course, there are millions of teachers. Um, and the survey that I used was conducted by the National Center for Education Statistics along with the Census Bureau. And of the millions of teachers, they sampled about 30,000 teachers. And I used a selection of those surveys to answer my research questions for my dissertation. Okay, we generalize the results from our sample to the population. The broadest level is the population. Okay, that's the broadest group. So my dissertation was about black teachers, right? So that's the broadest group. And then my sample came down to about 1,600 black teachers who were included in the survey. Um, we use probability sampling is the most considered the most rigorous form of sampling. We select as large a sample as possible, usually as large as we can afford. And census studies attempt to use the entire population. Of course, some people are missed, but they attempt to use the entire population. So, we think of the population, the group of individuals having one characteristic that distinguishes them from other groups, such as public school teachers. And then the target population or sampling frame is the actual list of sampling units from which the sample is collected. So if I had a list of all the teachers in the US, then my sample would be the group of participants that I draw from that list. Our goal when we're sampling is to draw valid inferences about the population based on the data we get from the sample. And there are a lot of ways this can go wrong that are listed on slide 11. Okay, so let's talk about different forms of data collection and surveys. Um, Most likely with most surveys, it's the participant who is recording the data. Mailed or emailed questionnaires are included in that. Electronic questionnaires are things like Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey. The participant is filling these out. Now, you could also do a survey where the researcher is collecting information, and the census is an example of where there's a they come and knock on your door, right? And they do a one-on-one interview to fill out the form. You could do a focus group interview, But often those are qualitative surveys, not quantitative surveys. And we're talking mostly about quantitative surveys. Same thing with telephone interviews. Those are sometimes quantitative surveys. So for example, when you when you talk to a customer service representative and then a computer comes on and says, "Are you willing to answer some questions about your experience?" And then you might have a telephone interview where you're rating that customer service representative using numbers. Interviews, though, on for the most of the time are qualitative in that we're trying to get people's stories and get their perspectives. Okay, so we'll talk more about interviews when we're talking about qualitative research. So, for mailed questionnaires, the investigator mails or emails a questionnaire to members of the sample. You might develop, modify, or use an existing questionnaire. The advantages are that you can reach a large geographic area relatively fast, and it may be economical, especially email. The disadvantage is that people might not return your survey, might not return your instrument. Also, there's no way to really ask follow-up questions usually. Online surveys or questionnaires, the survey instrument is available through the internet. The advantages, you quickly gather the data. You don't have to wait for something to be mailed out and then returned. Um, the format has been used often. It's pretty standardized. Like if you're using SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics, um, and that that's an advantage of using an established company to do your survey. It can be very economical. Disadvantages, you may have a low response rate. I mean, how many invitations to fill out a survey do folks get, and are they going to click on yours? Sometimes you have non-probability sampling because you somebody sends somebody else a link, and so you don't know exactly unless you control it with a password and that kind of thing. You may not know exactly who's filling out your survey. Also, there may be technical problems in the administration of your survey. Okay, so what's on the survey? Usually background questions like age or years of experience. Um, Attitude or opinion questions like whether a person agrees with a particular statement. And behavior questions like what has happened to you in the past? Did you take a semester off? That kind of thing. Sensitive questions, we want to be careful with questions about sensitive topics like drug and alcohol use, mental health issues, illegal behavior, that kind of thing. If you do need to include sensitive questions in your survey, some strategies include um, using them kind of later in the survey after a warm up. So you're not going to ask right out, so have you broken the law? No. Also, you might have comments that lead up to the question. So in past surveys, many have reported that on occasion they parked illegally. Have you ever parked illegally? That kind of thing. When you're doing a quantitative survey, it's almost always closed-ended questions. You pose a question, you provide a preset response option for the participant. You provide preset response options. It's practical and easy to compare the responses. It could be used for sensitive questions, and you can code numerically. That's the most important part is that quantitative surveys, remember, we're going to boil things down to a number, to a quantity, right? So we can code numerically fairly easily if it's a closed-ended question. Now, surveys can be used in a qualitative way where participants are providing their own responses, right? So you can have like a short answer or even a lot of space for um, for participants to share their perspectives. Okay. You can also have a semi-closed ended questions like where you're asking something very specific. Yeah, like other. Other. Can you, if you've listed all of these things. Is there anything else that we forgot to mention? Kind of thing. Now let's talk about response rate a little bit, just briefly. The response return rate is the percent of questionnaires that participants return to the researchers divided by well, it's a percent. So it's the number that you got back divided by the total number that you sent out. High response rates and give you more confidence when you're generalizing because you know that, okay, most of the people in your sample returned the questionnaire. So it's more likely that your sample is representative of the population that you're trying to target. Um, Bias is what you're really concerned about. If you have if only, I don't know, 40% of people who you sent the survey to sent it back, you may not be worried about it if it seems like it was random in terms of who sent it back. If only 40% sent it back and you notice that there's some characteristic that they all have in common, like let's say women were more likely to return your survey than the men in your sample, then you might be concerned about bias. If there's something that was leading a particular group to complete your survey and therefore another group may be underrepresented. And researchers use various strategies in order to improve response rate. So, for online questionnaires, this is a very common form of survey, right? So, some strategies that are used to improve response rate are pre-notifying the participants. You're getting an email that's saying that soon you'll be getting an email with a link to a survey. Using follow-up procedures, like reminding folks that your survey is out there after you've sent the email asking them to fill it out. Studying a problem interesting to the population under study, right? So if I get emails occasionally that are where someone wants me to fill out a survey, but it's not about education. It's not about children, it's about something else. I'm not likely to click on that. Um, so, uh, so mailing your questionnaire or emailing your request to folks who are actually interested in your topic can also help. Making the survey brief will help both with your response rate. If you say, oh, this survey is only going to take you 10 minutes. Um, and it will also help with the completion rate, the amount of the survey that your participants will complete. And then finally, considering the use of incentives. If you have some money, being able to say, hey, anybody who completes this survey is going to get a gift card, that always helps. So you can think of it as a three-phase survey administration period. The first step is well, I would put a pre-notify, right? Pre-notify before the start. Then you do your first mailing of the survey or emailing of the link. Then the second mailing of the survey or emailing of the link. And then finally a reminder, maybe a reminder postcard if it's a paper and pencil, or a reminder email. Most of the time, when you're doing surveys, it's going to start with a cover letter. Okay? And the cover letter is to inform the participant of what they're getting into and hopefully, convince them also to take your survey. The importance of the participant for you learning about your topic, um, the importance of your topic, the purpose of your study, an assurance of confidentiality or anonymity, even if that is available to your participants. You need to let them know who's sponsoring your research, usually who your advisor or professor is, the institution, the funder, the IRB office, that kind of thing. How long it will take to complete the survey, and finally what they should do with it at the end. Particularly if it's a mail-in survey, they need to know how to get it back to you. In terms of designing your survey, you want it to be easy to read. You want to begin with questions that are easy to answer, and that might be demographic or personal questions. It might not be. Sometimes those are at the end. You might use different types of closed-ended questions like certain, multiple choice that have yes, strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, and you have those, and then you ask another question, most important, somewhat important, not important, kind of thing. Um, Open-ended questions, it's often very important that at the end you have a box where folks can type, is there anything else you'd like to add? And sometimes you get important information from that last box that you wouldn't have gotten any other way. Visually appealing layout. You want there to be white space. Okay, you don't want all the text to be crowded on the screen, and questions should be grouped sensibly. You might use one scale that applies to multiple questions, so they're not having to rethink about. Okay, wait, what? What was I? What am I trying to? Am I trying to indicate how much I agree? What am I doing? And then finally, some kind of closing statement and thank you. Okay, here is my checklist for analyzing questionnaire data. And this is, yeah, I had to modify what was in your textbook because it wasn't actually accurate for what is most common in education and counseling research nowadays. All right, first of all, you're going to identify your response rate and, maybe try and see if there might be some bias. And the way you do that is you develop a table for the percent of responses to the survey and any data that you may have about the respondents, and as compared to the data about the population. So, for example, we know that in the general population, about half of adults are female. And so you might have your not only your percent of responses, but if your survey went out to a general population of adults, the percent of respondents who are female. Okay. You would conduct a preliminary analysis. Step two is to conduct a preliminary analysis in order to clean and organize the data. Okay. Um, you would calculate and develop a table of descriptive statistics, and we'll talk more about these, mean, variance, and range for each question in the instrument. Then you would develop scales by combining questions in the instrument. For example, you might notice as you're looking through your responses that, hey, the way the there were certain questions that really seemed to go together, and people who answered in a particular way on question two answered in a certain way on question six, and those because they're really asking the same thing. And so I may want to combine those questions. Those really aren't talking about separate concepts, right? So by looking at your descriptive statistics, you might be able to develop a scale by combining, and usually that's by adding if all of the response choices are the same, or averaging responses. And you might check for the reliability of the scores, like using a coefficient of internal consistency, and are we going to cover that? We're not really going to cover that. I wouldn't worry about that for this class. Um, yes. And then, yeah, we're not going to worry about checking for the validity of scores on the scale. So I crossed out some of these things that don't apply to us. And finally, you're going to analyze the data. Okay, so you had a table with every single question, but when you're analyzing the data, you're trying to really understand what your participants are telling you. So we want to maybe first start out by developing a demographic profile of our sample. Okay, so what was what was the gender of our respondents? What was the race, the ethnicity, the language spoken, the age, the years of experience at whatever thing we're asking them about, that kind of thing. So we would first describe the personal factors um, um, that reflect our sample. And then we would analyze the data to provide answers to descriptive questions in the study. And most of the questions are going to be descriptive, right? But I put if any. And then we'd analyze data to using inferential statistics. So often our third research question, perhaps our last research question, might be comparing groups or relating to variables. And we'd use inferential statistics to address those research questions or hypotheses. Okay, so we'd have kind of like the demographic profile, then a description of what our respondents said about our topic, and then finally how one thing related to another thing in our survey. And we'd write a report presenting these results. Yeah. Potential ethical issues in survey research. You might overstate the benefits of participating in the study. Usually, the studies that we do may not benefit the participant directly. It could benefit others like the participant. Okay. We never want to place interviewers or participants in unsafe situations. So, uh, um, most of the this applies to particularly if you're doing a face-to-face type survey, but also if you are asking sensitive questions, um, you want to make sure that participants know that you want to make it easy for the participants to stop at any time so that if if there's somebody who comes and there's suddenly somebody looking over their shoulder, they can X out and maybe get back to it later, that kind of thing. Protecting the confidentiality of survey responses. Um, you never know. You never know who knows whom. You never know who, yeah, you never know who is whose supervisor, who goes to church with who knows whose kids from Little League or soccer or whatever. So making sure that basically no one who doesn't need to know, no one who's among the researchers can match the survey responses to a specific individual. Okay, along with this is sometimes identities of individuals might be disclosed through a data analysis of a subset. So if I did a survey of teachers at a school and I say that, according to my survey, male second grade teachers say that they are not getting enough support. Well, what if there's only one male second grade teacher? I've just basically outed that person. And so that can be a problem. Being very careful when we're doing when we're discussing subsets of our participants. And then finally, not destroying data at the conclusion of the study. You're supposed to, with your IRB application, you're supposed to say when you're going to destroy the data. And a lot of times researchers hold on to it because they're like, oh, I might get one more paper out of this. Oh, this might be useful in the future. And then they don't destroy it and they've kind of violated the agreement that they had said. Okay, let's see. What else do we have? Okay, I put an appendix here. Here's some question construction mistakes that are made. And it's highly recommended that you pilot test your survey on someone, have someone do it and talk aloud to you while they're doing it so that you can, catch anything that that you didn't expect, that might be confusing, that people might misinterpret, that kind of thing. All right, that's it for survey design. See you next time.